You're back?
Well, how about that? You're back.
Yes.
They're back.
They are. Like magic, they're back. Our last week of the holiday season. We're in between Christmas and New Year's as we record today. We're on session number 45. Wow. We finished up letter number 74 last time. It was the letter that was a long explanation. KH was trying to be more like Morya.
Very direct.
He had written a letter to Hume, but he was very nervous about sending it because he was afraid it would offend his English sensitivity, and with good reason, because Hume has a very big ego and he is extremely sensitive to that. Anyone that he thinks is attacking his ego, he gets very angry. Even though he accused Morya of getting angry when he was countered on anything, but that wasn't true at all. He was just very adamant about what he wanted to express. And KH is trying to do the same thing. So this now is another follow-up, but this is strictly for Sinnett this time. And it's, again, a letter full of information for potential Chelas. What is going to be expected? What is going to be required of them? There was one question that Amal had, and the question was, what is the difference between spirits and shells? Because we talked about shells, which is a term used only in theosophical language, and something that the spiritualists and the religious people didn't use at all until theosophy came along. So what is the difference? It comes into play specifically in the after-death scenario. So just to recap quickly, when a person dies, the physical body, the etheric double, and the prana, which animates it and makes it alive, all die at basically the same time, almost immediately. And then all that's left are four principles: the astral, lower mental and higher mental, Buddhic, and Atmic. So in the after-death state, Buddhic and Atmic are just kind of hanging out. And the only thing in play, for the most part, are these two: the astral, the emotions, and the two levels of the mental activity in that human being. But even the mental part is paralyzed, so to speak, at first. So in the Kama Loka, the first period of Bardo, it's the astral. And it's very similar to the dream state. When a person is dreaming at night, they're not fully conscious at all. In fact, that is one of the states of consciousness in the sutras.
Svapna.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And so you're not at all fully conscious in that period. It's very vague, very dreamy. You don't have a lot of control over it. Most people don't. After that, then the state, if you have merited it, is the Devachan period. After going through a change, a gestation, similar to what a butterfly has gone through before it transforms from a caterpillar into a butterfly. So there's a gestation, a changeover, and then the individual awakens in Devachan, where it is, again, a dreamlike state, but entirely blissful. Nothing but the highest, most peaceful, blissful state, filled with love. Hatred is gone. That was finished off in the Kama Loka. Spirits. The term came from the Bible, of course. They talk about bad spirits sometimes, but it's a vague concept. It's basically, from a religious point of view and from the spiritualist point of view, the after-death state of a person. The spiritualists were convinced that it was completely spiritual in nature, meaning heavenly. It's not. The Kama Loka is anything but heavenly. But the later one, the Devachan, could be considered like that. So, what's the difference between spirits and shells? What we're learning from the Mahatmas is that what is actually contacted by mediums is obviously not the actual person, but rather, in most cases, strictly that dreamlike individual who is not fully there. In fact, if you've ever gone to a seance or to a medium who is supposedly channeling these spirits, you will notice that this individual that appears is pretty vacuous, doesn't have much to say or anything of substance, really. So that is the shell. It's just a fragment of the individual. It's basically the leftover part of the astral being once the mental part is removed from it. Very little to contact. So Shella is just an empty vehicle, basically, with vague memories.
It's mainly the astral vehicle.
Yes,
right?
it is. It is astral and nothing else. Mediums cannot really contact the person in Devachan. They're in total bliss. They're totally removed from the physical world. And there is no valid reason for that individual to interrupt that blissful state to communicate with somebody on Earth.
That's not what they're doing in a seance. They're contacting the shell of the individual in Kama Loka prior to Devachan.
And also after, because once they have transferred into Devachan, there's still a remnant of it, but it's even less.
The astral vehicle or the shell will dissipate.
Yes.
But maybe not right away. Maybe it takes years, perhaps.
It depends on the strength of it, how much energy is wrapped up in it. And elementals will come along and animate it and make it appear to be active.
This is another thing I don't know that we emphasize very much, though. The whatever is being contacted, the shell, may not even be the dream state of the person. It may be a trick. We did say that, but maybe not emphasize that it could be another entity occupying the shell, so to speak.
And they love to do that. Yeah. Elementals, for them, it's being in a play.
Now, not to speak over you, but from many people's perspective, the terms shell and spirit could be interchangeable, but not specifically from the Mahatmas. When we hear of seances and mediums outside of this context, I would say that they're contacting spirits. We're calling them shells here. But how do the Mahatmas distinguish the word spirit? They don't really use spirit in this sense, do they?
No, and this is what we're pointing out.
Yeah.
The term spirit is very vague, an imaginary something that the spiritualists were using because they were always contacting spirits. And this is what they were actually contacting were shells.
You could refer to our highest aspect, our highest principle as spirit, because that is pure spirit, but not spirits that are being contacted. That's the main distinguishing factor, I guess.
Exactly.
But you're right. The word spirit can refer to anything that's metaphysical, really. It's vague. Yeah, I wonder what the dictionary would say about spirit.
It would be completely wrong, I can tell you. But as they pointed out in one of the letters, the only spirits they recognize are the planetary spirits because they operate entirely on the highest plane of spirituality, right below the absolute, which is non-existent. All right, let's move on here now. We're on letter number 75. It was received at Shimla sometime after August 23rd. And we've received a lot of information. KH has been very busy trying to keep up with not only everything else he's got to do, but also with his correspondence with Hume and with Sinnett. So this one is strictly for Sinnett.
Strictly private and confidential. My patient friend. Yesterday, I had a short note posted to you, and it accompanied a long letter to Hume I had mailed somewhere in Central Province by a happy, free friend.
So he's writing this one day after he sent the very, very long letter, and it was mailed somewhere in Central Province, an area of India, by a happy, free friend. And the supposition is that that is someone who is neither a Mahatma nor a Chela.
Happy and free, that's funny. And he also said short note.
Well, he sent a note to Sinnett, but accompanied by a very long letter.
Today, it is a long letter to you and is intended to be accompanied by a tolling of jeremiads, a doleful story of discomfiture, which may or may not make you laugh, as it does that bulky brother of mine. Just the bulky
Morya.
brother. My goodness. All right, what the heck is a jeremiad and a discomfiture?
So what the hell is he talking about? A jeremiad comes from the Bible. The book of Jeremiah and the book of Lamentations were written by the same prophet or same individual. And it's a very sad, doleful story about the destruction of Jerusalem in, I think, around 587 BC, something like that, by the Babylonians. They were completely sacked. And the Jews were obviously extremely upset. And for many decades, they lamented this destruction of their beloved city and their culture. And so this book of Lamentations is a book of poems all about this period when they were going through such distress. So that's what he's talking about, a doleful story of discomfiture, which may or may not make you laugh as it does that bulky brother of mine. Morya, remember, is about 6'8" and is a big man.
Oh, I thought he was like very thin and tall.
Well, he's not big like a European and American would be considered bulky. It's more height.
I hear you muttering under breath. Now, what in the world does he mean? Patience, my best Anglo-Indian friend, patience. And when you have heard of the disreputable conduct of my wicked, laughing brother, my gosh, you will see why I now regret tasting the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in Europe instead of remaining in Asia in all the holy simplicity of ignorance of your ways and manners, because if I had, I would be grinning now too. Oh my gosh. I wonder what you will say when you learn the dreadful secret. I long to be delivered of a nightmare. Were you to meet me now and demand the whole truth, I would tell you, though it is unfavorable for me. My answer would remind the world, if you were cruel enough to repeat it, that I am the scapegoat for the sins of the brotherhood. But let's get to facts. I think the old lady told you that when we take candidates for Chelas, they take the vow of secrecy and silence respecting every order they may receive. One has to prove himself fit for Chelasship before he can see if he is fit for adeptship.
And it's important to keep in mind when he says order that no Chela is required to do what they tell them to do. They always have the option of opting out. For example, Damodar was asked to become the intermediary for delivering psychically letters to the two Englishmen, and he declined. And they didn't give him any grief over it. It's because they do get to make their own decisions. They're not servants. They're not required to follow orders like someone in the military would be.
They're spending so much time and their energy with the two Englishmen, and yet they're not Chelas. How do they even have time to spend time on their actual Chelas?
That's a very good question. We'll get a little more information, but they are putting an enormous amount of energy into these two guys.
I mean, these letters would take hours to write, and this is the next day. He did this the previous day, now he's another day. Wow.
So they're spending an enormous amount of energy on these two because there is so much at stake. This is a project that will transform the entire world if it works.
It's safe to assume they don't have a single white person, Chela.
No, they do. They have, remember in a previous letter, they barely referenced it, but there are 2 English men who are adepts, actually.
We did learn of that, yes.
But obviously, they chose not to be involved in this project.
The majority of their Chelas are Eastern people. They're not of the Western world, and that's the whole point of this.
Right. And here's the crux of the situation. There are lots of Chelas who are very informed in the secret doctrine, but very few of them have the capability to translate it and preach it in the Western world in a way that it would be taken up by the people who hear it.
It's their dharma or their race structure. They're not built for that type of work.
Exactly. So that's what they're looking for. These 2 guys, if they can bring themselves up to the standards, are perfect. They know the culture. They are well-spoken. They are well-traveled. They've got all of the experience that they need. If they can just get rid of some of the qualities that are holding them back.
The Mahatmas' extremely intensive efforts will be rewarded infinite fold. If the project works, the whole Western world could be transformed. Fern is under such a probation, and a nice mess they have prepared for me between the 2 of them. As you already know from my letter to Hume, I had no interest in Fern. I knew nothing of him beyond his remarkable faculties, his powers for clairaudience and clairvoyance, and his still more remarkable tenacity of purpose, strong will, etc. A loose, immoral character for years, he had entirely and suddenly reformed after joining the Theosophical Society, and Morya took him seriously in hand. It is not my business to tell you how much of his visions is truth and how much hallucination, or maybe even fiction. That he bamboozled our friend Hume considerably must be true, since Mr. Hume tells me the most marvelous yarns about him. But the worst of all this business is this: he bamboozled him so well that, whereas Hume did not believe one word when Fern was speaking the truth, nearly every lie uttered by Fern was accepted as gospel truth by our respected president of the eclectic.
So Hume is so clueless that when Fern was telling the truth, he disbelieved him. And when he was telling a story, he did believe it.
And this is exactly an example of discernment that we keep preaching.
Yes. And without discernment, you're not going anywhere. And guess what discernment requires? Getting rid of ego. Your ego puts all of these filters between you and truth. And if you say, yeah, well, I kind of like my ego, then you're going to be stuck with it for a long, long time.
That was a knowledge bomb right there. The ego puts all kinds of filters between us and truth.
Yes. Yes, it does.
We could end the session right there. Take that seriously.
All right, let's
go. Now you will readily understand that it is impossible for me to set Hume straight, since Fern is Morya's Chela. Fern is Morya's Chela.
Well, potential Chela. He's not a Chela, not an accepted Chela. He is a Chela on probation. And remember, there are 4 of them on probation. Hume, Sinnett, C.C. Massey, and Fern. And Fern is the only one who knows that he's on probation, and it's because he is clairvoyant. So they're able to communicate psychically with him, but not with either Hume or Sinnett. And C.C. Massey is somewhat psychic, but he isn't perceptive enough to realize who they are.
And I have no right whatever to interfere between the 2 of them. Of the several grievances, however, that is the smallest. Another of our customs, when corresponding with the outside world, is to entrust a Chela with the task of delivering the letter or message and, unless absolutely necessary, to never give it a thought.
These Chelas are actively working with the Mahatmas to get their projects done, taken care of. And sometimes it involves delivering either physically in those days or psychically, which is more often the case now, a message to someone else. But they're expected not to pay any attention to it because it's very private information. And again, if they have too big of an ego or are anxious to prove to other people that they are a Chela, they might be tempted to share that information to impress somebody. They have to be able to, and HPB was very good at this, to give a message to somebody and then forget what it was even about.
Very often our letters, unless something very important and secret, are written in our handwriting by our Chelas.
Yeah, a lot of the letters that we have by KH weren't actually written by him, but the handwriting cannot be distinguished from his.
You're saying the handwriting of the person who actually wrote it cannot be distinguished from
KH's. And it's because they're completely in sync mentally. So it's almost like automatic writing.
Mm-hmm. Thus, last year, some of my letters to you were precipitated, but when sweet and easy precipitation was stopped, well, I had only to compose my mind, assume an easy position, and think, and my faithful disinherited, DK, simply had to copy my thoughts, making only occasionally a blunder.
So you see, it's like he's dictating a letter mentally to his Chela. His Chela is physically writing it in his handwriting and in his words.
Ah, my friend, I had an easy life of it until the day when the eclectic sprang into existence.
Yeah.
That's Hume's...
That's the Shimla Eclectic Society, which was a branch of the TS.
This year, for reasons we need not mention, I have to do my own work, the whole of it, and I have a hard time of it sometimes and get impatient over it.
So now he's having to write the letters himself. Imagine the time that takes.
So something is preventing, wasn't it one of his bosses, he said you have to stop doing that?
Yes, the Chohan. We suppose it was because it took so much energy, so much psychic energy, and then they don't have it available to do other projects.
But he does say sweet, simple precipitation, which makes it sound like it's not a lot of energy required.
That was only the first few letters, 2 years previous. And then he could think of it in his own mind. The words would form on a piece of paper somewhere else and then be delivered. That is kind of like a psychic fax machine. Think of it here, 1,000 miles away, the letter appears, boom. And it could be almost instantaneous sometimes.
In the innocence of my unsophisticated soul, I one day trusted my sacred correspondence to the hands of that alter ego of mine, the wicked and imperious chap, your illustrious, who took undue advantage of my confidence in him and placed me in the position I am now in.
So he's talking about months ago when he went into Samadhi and he entrusted the correspondence to Morya, and he's intimating here that that was a big mistake, but he's being kind of funny about it.
The wretch laughs since yesterday, and to tell the truth, I feel inclined to do the same. But as an Englishman, I am afraid you will be terror-struck at the enormity of his crime.
And he's being facetious.
You know that, notwithstanding his faults, Mr. Hume is absolutely necessary, so far, to the Theosophical Society. I sometimes get very irritated at his petty feelings and spirit of vindictiveness, but nevertheless, I have to put up with his weaknesses, which lead him at times to vex himself over nothing. But our illustrious is not precisely of that opinion. Mr. Hume's pride and self-opinion, he argues, wish, as our saying goes, that all mankind had only 2 bent knees to make puja to him, which is worship, and Morya is not going to humor him.
So that's apparently a Tibetan saying, and he quotes them every once in a while. Some of them are a little abstruse and hard to figure out, but this one is pretty accurate for Hume. He's a person who wishes that the entire world only had two knees to make kneeling worship of him.
He will do nothing, of course, to harm or even to vex him purposely. On the contrary, he intends to always protect him as he has done until now, but he will not lift his little finger to set him straight.
Remember, in the last letter, K.H. let Sinnett know that Hume was being assailed, unknown to him, by this Mirza Murad Ali Beg, who was intent on destroying him and his family. And this was a man who practiced black magic. So he had some power. And Morya was protecting Hume from this and not bragging about it or even letting Hume know about it. Hume was completely unaware of his protection.
The substance of his argument is summed up in the following. Hume laughed at real, genuine phenomena, the production of which have brought us well nigh into the Chauhan's disgrace, only because the manifestations were not sketched by himself and were not produced in his honor or for his sole benefit.
Yeah, if he wasn't involved in it, then it was fake.
So now let him feel happy and proud of mysterious manifestations of his own making. Let him taunt Sinnett in the depths of his proud heart, and throw out hints to others that he, Sinnett, was not so favored.
Yeah, Hume is very vindictive and carries a grudge for a long, long time. So he's apparently now intent on trying to make Sinnett feel bad that he hasn't been so favored as Fern has.
No one has ever attempted a deliberate deception. Everything was made to follow its natural, ordinary course. Fern is in the hands of two clever dwellers of the threshold, as Bulwer Lytton would call them. Oh wow, he mentions that here. Two Dugpas kept by us to do our scavenger's work and to draw out the latent vices from the candidates, if there are any.
This is very, very interesting. Yeah. They keep two Dugpas on hand for testing Chelas. He'll tell us later that one of them, at least, is not an actual Dugpa, but a former Dugpa, and that he's trying to reform himself. But he points out that he will not be able to do that in this lifetime. He's got a very long road ahead of him to get back on the right path.
I wonder how they do that, how the Dugpas draw out the latent vices from the candidates.
We're going to see in just a short time.
Wow. And Fern has shown himself, on the whole, far better and more moral than he was imagined to be. Wow.
Now, this is something that isn't pointed out very often. We're often given the story that Fern was this ne'er-do-well and had psychic ability, but never went very far. And here he's refuting that. He's saying that he had some really, really good qualities. And if he wanted to, he could overcome any of the defects that he had. He was boastful, he was a braggart, and kind of offensive to some people. But on the other hand, he had some real talent, and he was very, very intelligent.
Fern has done only what he was ordered to do, and he holds his tongue because it is his first duty. As to his pretending to be a seer with Hume and others, since he has convinced himself to believe it, there is no real harm done except to himself.
Now, here's the first time we find out that something actually did occur. Fern actually did have one or more visions. We'll find out the source of those visions.
Hume's jealousy and pride will always get in the way, and Sinnett is shrewd enough to separate Fern's realities from his dreams. Why then should I, or you, or anyone else, concludes Morya, offer advice to one who is sure not to accept it? Or worse, in case he learns for certain that he has been permitted to make a fool of himself, is still more sure to become an irreconcilable enemy to the society, the cause, the much-suffering founders, and everyone. Leave him alone, then. He will not be thankful for undeceiving him. On the contrary, he will forget that no one is to blame but himself. You, K.H., gave him one genuine puka phenomenon, and that ought to satisfy him as to the possibility of everything else. Oh yeah, I forgot that this is Morya speaking to K.H., right? Such is Morya's reasoning, and were I not indirectly mixed up in the quid pro quo, it would also be mine. But now, owing to the machinations of that little double-dealing monkey Fern, oh my gosh, double-dealing monkey? Wow. He's an Englishman, right, Fern?
Well, he was actually born in India,
Okay.
but he's English.
I am compelled to disturb you for some friendly advice, since our ways are not your ways, and vice versa. But here's what happened. Hume has lately received a good many letters from me, and I hope you will kindly follow with me the fate of 3 of them, ever since he began to receive them in a direct way. I wonder what that means.
I'm not quite sure.
Try to understand the situation and thus realize the position I'm in, since we had 3 Chelas at Shimla, 2 regular ones and 1 an irregular one, the candidate Fern. I conceived the unfortunate idea of saving power, of economizing.
Between the 2 of them, they had 3 Chelas. 2 of them are actual Chelas in Shimla. And then the irregular one was Fern. So he was using the 2 Chelas to transmit information to him, to economize energy.
Is it safe to assume that it's Damodar and DK?
No, Damodar was in Pune, remember? He got exiled for a few weeks to recuperate.
Oh, right. To tell the truth, I sought to separate as much as possible the suspected headquarters from every phenomenon produced at Shimla, hence, from the correspondence that passed between Mr. Hume and myself. Unless HPB, Damodar, and Deb were entirely disconnected, there was no saying what might or might not happen. The first letter, the one found in the conservatory, I gave to Morya to have left at Mr. Hume's house by one of the 2 regular Chelas. He gave it to Subba Rao, for he had to see him on that day. Subba Rao posted it to Fern, with instructions to either leave it at Mr. Hume's house or to send it to him through the post if he were afraid that Mr. Hume should ask him, since Fern didn't have the right to answer him and thus would be led to telling an untruth.
So that's the first letter he's going to talk about.
Several times DK had tried to penetrate into Rothney Castle, Hume's mansion. Wow, it's called Rothney Castle?
Yes, on Jacko Hill.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I wish we had a photo of it. It was apparently quite magnificent.
I wonder if there is any history on that, or if it's even still there. Or
I don't know. I'll have to see if there's anything. There's more information on the internet now than ever before. Right. So sometimes we can discover stuff that no other researchers have been able to come up with.
So he's saying Jwal Kul had tried to penetrate into the castle, penetrate with his mind.
Astrally,
yeah,
in order to deliver letters. But I guess because of the atmosphere, he wasn't able to, and he'll explain.
But suffered each time so acutely that I told him to give it up. Oh my gosh. He is preparing for initiation and might easily fail as a consequence. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so when any of their Chelas are preparing for another level through initiation, they have to go through a process, and they, as much as possible, need to be kept away from the outside world and the influences. Because, as he says, he could easily fail because of those influences.
Wow. My goodness. Well, Fern did not post it, but sent a friend his Dugpas.
And that's one of, I think, KH's Dugpas, who Fern considered a friend.
To leave it at the house, and the latter placed it in the conservatory about 2 a.m. This was half of a phenomenon, but Hume took it for an entire thing and got very mad when Morya refused, as he thought, to take up his answer in the same way. Then I wrote to console him and told him as plainly as I could, without breaking Morya's confidence in relation to Fern, that DK could do nothing for him at present, and that it was one of Morya's Chelas that had placed the letter there.
So he's explaining that Hume got angry because he received this letter phenomenally, and then he said, okay, I'm going to write an answer to it, but I want him to pick it up the same way. And they weren't able to because of this situation with DK unable to penetrate Rothney Castle. So he tried to explain it without divulging who was involved or too much of the circumstance. And Hume wasn't impressed. He was just angry.
I believe the hint was broad enough and no deception practiced. The second letter, I think, was thrown onto his table by Joalcool, and as it was done by himself, it was a Pukka orthodox phenomenon, and Hume has no need to complain.
Pukka, Pukka, is a Tibetan word that means genuine, a real one.
Several were sent to him in various ways, and he may be sure of one thing. However ordinary the means by which the letters reached him, they could not be anything but phenomenal in reaching India from Tibet.
This is the stupid thing about Hume. All of these things that happen, he discounts one after the other, not taking into account the totality of the situation. The very fact that these letters could be transmitted from Tibet to India in 1882 instantaneously, and there was no mail service between the two. There was no mail service because at one point they told us that in order for that to happen, they would have to make arrangements with the Chinese government, and apparently that wasn't about to happen.
But this does not seem to be taken into any consideration by him. And now we come to the really bad part of it, for which I blame Morya entirely for permitting it and exonerating Fern, who could not help it. Of course, you understand that I write to you in strict confidence, relying upon your honor, and whatever happens, you will not betray Fern. Indeed, I have looked most attentively into the thing. The boy was led to become guilty of a deliberate Jesuitical deception through Hume's constant insults, suspicious attitude, and deliberate slights at meals and during the hours of work, more than from any motives in consequence of his loose notions of morals.
He's going to explain the third letter that comes into play here.
Then Morya's letters, the production of the amiable Dugpas, actually ex-Dugpas, whose past sins will never permit him to fully atone for his misdeeds, distinctly say, do such and such, or in such a way. They tempt him and lead him to imagine that in doing no injury to any human being, and when the motive is good, every action becomes acceptable.
So it's the Dugpas who are imitating the Mahatmas in these visions.
Oh.
So Fern did obviously have some kind of vision or visions in which the Mahatmas appeared to him. But the test was whether or not he could figure out if they were genuine.
Wow.
And apparently he couldn't.
I was thus tempted in my youth and nearly succumbed twice to the temptation, but was saved by my uncle from falling into the monstrous snare.
So KH almost fell into the same snare because he was tempted the same way. And this wouldn't have been that many years previous. Remember, he is one of the youngest adepts, and he's not even a full adept yet. When the correspondence began, the supposition is that he had been an adept for approximately 25 years, because in one of the letters he mentioned something about a quarter century that he had been an adept. So that's not very long.
I still find it interesting that the Dugpas are working with the Mahatmas on this.
Yeah, but remember, that is their goal, is to recruit Chelas for themselves. It's like in the corporate world, if you have one corporation who can steal an important employee away from another corporation, they think that's a great feat.
I wonder whose idea that was. Was it the masters? They requested of the Dugpas, hey, impersonate us and see if they fall for it. Or if the Dugpas just came up with that test on their own.
No, I'm sure that the Mahatmas came up with that. And remember, at least one of these is an ex-Dugpa. He's trying to redeem himself.
I was thus tempted in my youth and nearly succumbed twice to the temptation, but was saved by my uncle from falling into the monstrous snare. And so was the illustrious, wow, so he was too.
Yeah.
Who is a Pukka Orthodox occultist and holds religiously to the old traditions and methods.
Yeah, he's a traditionalist.
Wait, the illustrious
is Morya.
Is Morya. So he was tested as well as a kid. Oh my gosh. And so would any one of you, had I consented to accept you for Chelas. But as I was aware from the first of what you have confessed to in a letter to HPB, namely that there was something supremely revolting to the better class of European minds in that idea of being tested, of being under probation, I therefore had always avoided the acceptance of Mr. Hume's often expressed offer to become a Chela. This may perhaps give you the key to the whole situation.
And it does indeed.
Wow.
So we learn now that even though these two Englishmen, plus another one, C.C. Massey, are under probation, they don't know about it because they told the Mahatmas, two of them did, we're not going to be tested. Don't even waste your time on that.
Like they get to choose how it works.
Yeah, exactly. They really felt that that was a terrible idea and that it was completely unnecessary. So at the same time, Hume kept saying, I want to be a Chela, I want to be a Chela, implying that I want to be a Chela, but without any testing. So they took him at his word and started testing him because there's no other way to do it. They have to be tested. And it's not just for the masters to find out. It's for the probationist to know whether or not he is capable of things. Oh, of course, I would never do that. Well, let's test it out just to be sure. And then they fail one after the other.
However, this is what happened. Fern had received a letter of mine through a Chela with instructions that it reach its destination immediately. They were going to take breakfast, and there was no time to lose. Fern had thrown the letter on a table and ought to have left it there, since there would have been no reason for him to lie then. But he was vexed with Hume, and he devised another idea. He placed the letter in the folds of Mr. Hume's napkin, who took it up and accidentally shook out the letter onto the floor, to the terrible fright of Moggy and the contented surprise of Hume.
Moggy is his wife, who, remember, is addicted to alcohol, so her nerves are probably a little fragile.
Oh, gosh. But his old suspicion returning to him, a suspicion he had always harbored since I wrote to him that my first letter was brought into the conservatory by one of Morya's Chelas, and that my Chela could do little, though he had visited invisibly every part of the house before, Hume looked at Fern and asked whether it was he who had placed it there.
Now, this is really, really interesting, so pay close attention to this.
Now I have the entire picture before me of Fern's brain at that moment.
All right, so psychically, he's pulling up the video of Fern
Like in the Akashic Records.
in the Akashic Records, and he's tuned in completely to exactly what he's thinking.
There's the rapid flash in it. Quote, "This saves me, for I can swear I never put it there," meaning the spot on the floor where it had fallen.
So he's seeing what he's seeing
Yes.
and hearing what he is thinking, just like a movie,
Yes.
with the added ability of seeing thoughts.
So he says no. If Hume would have said, "Did you put it in my napkin?" then he couldn't have said no. 'Cause he then mentally added, "I didn't put it there." Then a vision of Morya and a feeling of intense satisfaction and relief for not having been guilty of a direct lie.
So immediately he thought of Morya, the one who had him under probation, and saying, okay, I passed that test.
And Fern certainly added the "I didn't put it there" part, so
Right.
Morya and the masters would know that he believes he's not lying, even though he is not telling the whole
Because
truth.
remember, he was raised by and instructed by Jesuits.
Confused pictures of some Jesuits he had known, of his little child, a disconnected thought of his room and beams in Mr. Hume's garden, etc. Not a thought of self-deception.
So he's seeing just these little random thoughts that popped into his mind one after another. We all do it.
Mm-hmm.
So they can read every single thing in your mind and go back in time to read them.
It's amazing. So you see my situation. Morya gives me carte blanche to tell you anything I like, but he will not have me say a word to Hume. Nor would he ever forgive you, he says, were you to interfere between the punishment of Hume's pride and his fate. Fern is not really to be blamed for thinking that, so long as the result is accomplished. The details are of no importance, since he was brought up at such a school, and he really has the welfare of the cause at heart. Whereas with Hume, it is really bona fide selfishness, egotism, his chief and only motivational power. Egotistic philanthropist is a term which paints his portrait at full length.
They actually have a pretty good opinion of Fern, thinking that he still has a very good chance of succeeding. They don't have such a great view of Hume, unfortunately, because of his enormous ego. Now, Fern has an ego, but not anywhere near as big as Hume's. So the term egotistic philanthropist paints his portrait at full length. That's Hume to a T.
I love KH's words.
I do too. He has such a way of expressing things.
Now for Colonel Chesney. Since he was kind enough to discern something in the outlines of your poor humble friend's face, an impression drawn most probably from the depths of his imagination rather than from any real presence of such an expression in Djwal Khul's or M's production, the former felt quite proud and begged my permission to precipitate another such likeness for Colonel Chesney.
Colonel Chesney was an English military officer in northern India, quite renowned, quite well known. He had written a book and later wrote several other books along military lines, kind of military novel type. And he had become a friend of Sinnett's, and Sinnett was trying to convert him to Theosophy and was telling him all of the stories of his interactions with these Mahatmas. Right previous to this, Sinnett had been favored with not one, but two portraits of KH, both produced on the same day. And he was asking if he could get a third portrait for his friend, Colonel Chesney. So Djwal Khul was involved in this. Normally it would have been HPB, but this time Djwal Khul was the one who made the image appear, and he was quite proud of it.
Of course, the permission was granted, though I laughed at the idea, and Morya told DK that the colonel would also laugh at what he will suspect as my conceit. But DK wanted to try, and then went and begged permission to present it himself to Colonel Chesney, a permission which was, as a matter of course, refused by the Chauhan, and he was reprimanded.
So not only did he produce it, but then he says, let me deliver it to him, and the Chauhan said, no.
How does the Chauhan have time to pay attention to all these little details that are going on?
Because they have to request his permission for a lot of things. So he's basically the judge. Yes, no.
But the picture was ready 3 minutes after I had consented to it.
3 minutes.
DK did it that fast?
Yeah.
And DK seemed enormously proud of it. He says, and he is right, I think, that this likeness is the best of the three. It's funny how they use the word likeness.
Yeah, because it's not painted. It's produced phenomenally.
Well, it was delivered the usual way via Djwal Khul, Deb, and Fern, HPB and Damodar being both at Pune at that time. And we don't have any of these portraits.
No, I've never seen any of these privately produced ones.
Morya was training and testing Fern for a phenomenon, of course a genuine one, so that a puka manifestation could be produced in Colonel Chesney's house by Fern. But while Fern swore he needed only 3 months' preparation, Morya knew he would never be ready for this season, nor do I think he will be ready next year.
So Fern was that good. Wow. He was already psychically, clairvoyantly able to connect so well with the Mahatmas that they were already planning to start using him to see if he could work out for the same type of thing that HPB was producing and that DK was just learning how to do.
Anyhow, he entrusted the new picture to Fern, telling him again it would be better to send it by post. For were the colonel to ever learn that Fern was concerned in it, he would disbelieve even in its precipitated production. But DK wanted it delivered immediately, and while the colonel, as he said, had master hot in his head still, and Fern, the conceited young fool, answered, "No, before I do anything in connection with the packet, I must study him, Colonel Chesney, more fully. This time I want to obtain the best possible results on the first try. From what I have seen of the author of the Battle of Dorking,
That was the book he had written.
I have not been able to satisfy myself about him. Father told me to be his eyes and ears. He not always having the time. I must find out the character we have to deal with."
And the way it's written here, it's obvious that KH, again, is reading his mind. Little packets of information.
I wasn't clear, though. DK was physically in contact with Colonel Chesney also, because he must have been able to see him clearly. And
He was very psychic, so he saw him astrally.
oh, so he produced it that way. He didn't.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I guess that's possible, but wow, okay.
He produced it, but then it was delivered in the normal way, not phenomenally.
But DK wasn't physically.
No, he
in
wasn't. He
contact
was in Tibet.
Wow. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, exactly. And Hume doesn't recognize any of this.
In the interval, I, fearing that Master Fern might, perhaps, place the portrait in the folds of Colonel Chesney's napkin, oh gosh,
He's being facetious.
and produce some, quote, spiritual manifestation with his foot, end quote, I wrote to you from Pune through Damodar, giving you a very broad hint, I believe, which, of course, you did not understand, but will now. Meanwhile, yesterday morning, DK came and told me that Fern still had his picture, and that he feared that some trick had or would be played. Then I immediately aroused my too indifferent brother from his apathy. I showed him how dangerous the situation was, left in the unscrupulous hands of a boy whose sense of morality was still more blunted by the probation tests and deceit, which he regarded as permissible, and finally got him to act. Wow, if KH thinks so poorly of Fern, it's hard to believe that Morya is training him.
They have to give each one a chance if there's even a remote possibility.
Okay. A telegram was sent to Fern in Morya's own handwriting, this time from the central provinces where I believe a Chela lives, ordering Fern to immediately send the packet he had for the colonel by post. And Fern, I see, received it yesterday in the forenoon.
Now, this was actually the letter that we read in a previous session where, remember the one legitimate letter that Fern received that we know of that actually came from Morya? He wrote and talked about this packet, and this is the packet he was referring to.
And thus, when you hear of it, you will know the whole truth. I have strictly forbidden my letters or anything connected with my business to ever be given to Fern. So everyone at Shimla may take my word of honor that Fern will have nothing more to do with my business. Dang, he doesn't like this guy very much.
No, he doesn't.
But, my dearest friend, you must promise me faithfully, and for my sake, never to breathe one word of what I told you to anyone, least of all to Hume or Fern, unless Fern forces you by his fibs to stop him, in which case you may use what you think proper of it to force him to shut up, but without ever allowing him to know how, and from whom you have learned it. Apart from this, use of the knowledge is at your discretion. Read my letter carefully, my letter to Hume that you received yesterday, and think it over carefully before sending it to him. For this letter may provoke him to a fit of madness and hurt pride, and make him quit this society at once. Better keep it as means for future emergency to prove to him that at least I am one who will not permit even my enemies to be won over by unfair means. At least that's how I regard the means that Mr. Fern seems quite ready to use. But above all, good and faithful friend, do not allow yourself to misconceive the real position of our great brotherhood. Though to your Western mind the paths trodden and the ways by which our candidates are brought to the great light may seem dark and tortuous, you will be the first to approve of them when you know all. Do not judge on appearances. for you may thereby do a great wrong. But be vigilant and watch. If Mr. Hume just consents to wait, he will have far more extraordinary phenomena to silence the critics than he hitherto had. Exercise your influence with him. Remember, in November comes the great crisis, and September will be full of dangers. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, remember the end of the trial period comes up on November 17th, and they're trying to bring everything to a head. Let's put some pressure on Hume and see whether he's going to stick with us or not.
Save at least our personal relations from the great wreck. Fern is the strangest psychological subject I have ever met. The pearl is inside and truly profoundly hidden by the unattractive oyster shell. We cannot break it at once, nor can we afford to lose such subjects. While protecting yourself, protect him from Hume.
And then he makes a funny statement.
Protect him? Meaning protect Hume from Hume?
No, protect Fern from Hume.
Oh.
So he's talking about Fern. He's a strange individual, the strangest I've ever seen. But the pearl is inside, but they can't break the shell all at once. You can't destroy all of his bad characteristics. It's going to take time and care.
Normally, I never trust a woman any more than I would an echo. But with your lady, it is otherwise, and I firmly believe that you can trust her with the above, if you think it proper.
The Mahatmas aren't above being a little bit misogynistic.
Oh my gosh. Really?
And they're a product of their time. We have to remember that. Most of them became adepts decades, if not centuries before this. So they still carry some very, very traditional conservative ideas sometimes.
It begs the question, are there any women adepts at the time?
Not that we know of. There was one who is sometimes suspected to have been an adept, Magi. She was a hermit, basically, who lived, I believe, near Varanasi. And Damodar and HPB and Alcott visited her at different times. They revered her highly.
Wow.
But I guess we can point out, too, that once they become an actual adept, they have the option. They'd have no more personal karma to speak of except what they're picking up through interactions with Chelas. So they can choose to be reborn in whatever body they want.
That's
male,
true.
female, Asian, European, with whatever characteristics physically they choose to.
That's a very good point. And most of them choose to be born as men because they have an easier time at that period of time in history.
Far easier.
Yeah. So she took a big risk by Magi.
Yes, and apparently she had taken a new body at some point from a child who had just died. And this is one way that apparently they can continue life without a break in consciousness and without having to start with an infant body. So if it was like a 10-year-old girl that died by an accident, and she was aware that that was happening, boom, she could go into that body and keep it going.
And then that girl would not appear to have died.
Her consciousness would have just gone into her regular after-death state, which at 10 years old wouldn't have that much karma.
Her parents would realize this child is different.
Yes. Yes, of course they would. And who knows what they would attribute that to.
Yeah. But she wouldn't die.
No.
I mean, the body wouldn't have died.
Right.
I digress. We digress. But beware of poor Mrs. Gordon, an excellent lady, but she would talk death herself to death. My goodness. Oh, death herself. Oh, my gosh. But she would talk death herself to death. And now I have done. Yours ever faithfully, K.H.
Mrs. Gordon was the woman in Calcutta, remember, who had hosted Eglinton. She was a devout spiritualist and mediocre theosophist. So there's now a PS to this letter.
P.S. Please do not regard it as a compliment, but believe me when I say that your 2 letters, and especially The Evolution of Man, are simply superb.
So the 2 letters were letters that he sent to Staten Moses to be printed in light. And then Evolution of Man was an article he had written for the Theosophist.
Do not fear any contradictions or inconsistencies. I say again, make notes of them and send them to me, and you will see.
So that was a PS by KH. But remember, the previous day, he was apparently sitting side by side with Morya, and now Morya adds a PS to the letter.
And here's Morya's. I pray you, kind sir, to lock the foolish letter sent on yesterday to Hume Sahib into your trunk and leave it there to roost until in demand. I tell you, it will create mischief, and no good will come of it. KH is too sensitive by far. He is becoming a regular miss in your Western society. Yours, Morya.
That's quite a put down, a miss, meaning a young woman.
So Morya is basically telling Hume to ignore.
Yeah. KH has gotten too wound up about this whole thing, and this letter that he wrote to Hume that he obsessed about is going to do nothing but cause trouble. Put it away, lock it up in your trunk, and leave it there in case it's needed for any reason.
The one that we read in our last session.
Yeah, it actually covered 2 sessions. It was that long.
Where KH was being direct, and Morya is saying, ignore that.
Yeah. But remember, he was ordered by the Chohan to write the letter. So he really put a lot of effort into it. And maybe the Chohan has changed his mind at this point because he's reviewing all of this stuff that's going on. And Morya is just saying, forget about sending that letter, lock it up.
Let me refresh my memory. The letter was intended to put Hume in his place.
Right.
And like a coming to Jesus talk.
Right.
And Morya is suggesting that Hume doesn't receive it either at this point.
Right.
He's saying just don't send it to Hume at all. Really?
Because he knows what the result is going to be. And it's going to be anger and...
It's not going to have the intended effect, he's thinking.
No. Hume is incapable of changing his way.
But he's saying KH is far too sensitive?
Yes. But they disagree. They do things differently. And what I see over time is Morya becoming more sensitive and more compassionate, and KH becoming more like Morya.
Well, maybe they're both balancing out.
Yes, exactly. They right now have very, very different personalities, but through working together for so many years, they kind of merge. And you get the best of both. So it's actually very, very good. What another interesting letter that was.
My goodness.
So we find a lot of really, really good stuff. And we're going to keep going in our next session on more interesting stuff. All right, that's going to do it for session number 45. And we're going to see, hopefully, everyone again for session 46, another exciting episode.
How far would you say we're along in our process here?
We're well past the halfway mark, and this will speed up somewhat because we've covered a lot of the details that had to be gone into in order to understand everything. Now that we've got all of the basics under control, the rest of it can go faster.
Letter 76 next session. How many are there in the book total, approximately?
About 140, but there are many that are very short towards the end. We don't get as many of these long, long letters anymore. A few. There will still be a few long ones. He's going to have some other topics. For example, the God letter is really interesting. That's number 88. So that's one to look forward to.
That's a really good one.
A few things like that, but we have covered the great majority of the heavy doctrine. Now it's more stuff that is easily digestible. All right, we'll see you next time. Thank you for following along.
Thanks for watching.